All right, we're going to continue our reading of Maniac Magee. But before I get started on chapter 9, which is where we left off at the end of chapter 8, beginning of chapter 9, last time I just wanted to refresh your memory of what happened in the last section of the book. So in chapter 6, Mrs. Pickwell did her famous whistle that called all her children home, never late for dinner. And one of the children that ended up at her table, which she didn't even seem to notice because there's so many of them, was Maniac or Jeffrey Magee. He ate dinner at the Pickwells that night is all we can kind of assume from the conversation between the brothers and sisters that as they were cleaning up. They were like, who is this other kid? I thought he was your boyfriend. I thought he was your friend. And nobody knew who he was. So we have to assume that that was Jeffrey or Maniac Magee. In chapter 7, he hit a fast frog in the park home run. Pitched by John McNabb, who was not too happy about it whatsoever, about the fact that, number one, Jeffrey had managed to hit a whole bunch of home runs off of him and make a whole bunch of hits off of him when he was the best pitcher in the Little League. And then he threw him, so to try and get him back, he threw him a frog, and he thought that would trip him up, but it did not. He was able to hit that frog, bunt it very gently, so it did not hurt the frog, because it did jump away later, so we have to assume that it was not injured in any way, and that he did that bunt and then was able to make it all the way around back to home plate before John McNabb or any of the other players were able, well, really it was just John McNabb, to get that frog and touch him with it. In chapter 8, we learned that Jeffrey got the nickname of Maniac based on all these things that people were telling about him, his Finsterwalds rescue, how he went into the backyard of the Finsterwalds, how he caught the pass during the football practice and then was able to punt it back to them perfectly, and then also this fast frog example. And so people started to call him Maniac Magee. And we also learned that he is living at the zoo, at the deer shed, in the deer shed, and he's eating what the deer are eating, the apples and the bread and the other things that the deer are being fed. He's taking a little bit of that for himself, and he's sleeping under their shed or their little enclosure at the zoo where the deer live. Okay. Chapter 9. John McNabb had never in his life met a kid he couldn't strike out until the runt. Now, as he thought about it, he came to two conclusions. Number one, he couldn't stand having this blemish on his record. Number two, if you beat a kid up, it's the same as striking him out. So McNabb and his pals went looking for the kid. They called themselves the Cobras. Nobody messed with them, at least nobody in the West End. The Cobras had heard that the kid hung around the park and the tracks, and that's where they spotted him one Saturday afternoon on the tracks by the path that ran from the Oriole Street dead end to the park. He was down by Red Hill and heading away from them, book in hand as usual. But the Cobras just stood there, stunned. I don't believe it, one Cobra said. Must be a trick, said another. I heard about it, said another, but I didn't believe it. It wasn't a trick. It was true. The kid was running on the rail. Okay, now I just remembered that they did know at the Pickwells that it was him that left because the kids went out the back and they saw him running on the rails of the railroad tracks as he was leaving their house. So they did know it was him. McNabb scooped up a handful of track stones and he launched one. He snarled, "He's dead. Let's get him." By the time Maniac looked back, they were almost on him. He wobbled once, leaped from the rail to the ground, and took off. He was at the Oriole Street dead end, but his instinct said no, not the street. Too much open space. He stuck with the tracks. Coming into view above him was the house on Rayco Hill where he had eaten spaghetti. He could go there, to the whistling mother, the other kids, be safe. They wouldn't follow him there, would they? Stones clanked off the steel rails. He darted left, skirted the dump, wove through the miniature mountain range of stone piles and into the trees, skiing on his heels down the steep bank and into the creek, frogs plopping, no time to look for stepping rocks, yells behind him now, war whoops, stones pelting the water, stinging his back, the other side through the trees and picker bushes, past the armory jeeps and out to the Park Boulevard, past the Italian restaurant on the corner, the bakery, screeching tires, row houses, streets, alleys, cars, porches, windows, faces staring, faces, the town whizzing past Maniac, a blur of faces, each face staring from its own window, each face in its own personal frame, its own house, its own address, some place to be when there was no other place to be. How lucky to be a face staring out from a window. And then, could it be? The voices behind him were growing faint. He slowed, turned, stopped. They were lined up at the street a block back. They were still yelling and shaking their fists. But they weren't moving off the curb. And now they were laughing. Why were they laughing? The Cobras were standing at Hector Street. Hector Street was the boundary between the East and the West Ends. Or, to put it another way, between the blacks and the whites. Not that you never saw a white in the East End or a black in the West End. People did cross the line now and then, especially if they were adults and it was daylight. But nighttime, forget it. And if you were a kid, day or night, forget it. Unless you had business on the other side, such as a sports team or school. But don't be just strolling along as if you belonged there, as if you weren't afraid, as if you didn't even notice that you were a different color from everybody around you. The Cobras were laughing because they figured the dumb, scraggly runt would get out of the East End in about as good a shape as a bare big toe in a convention of snapping turtles. Chapter 10. Of course, Maniac didn't know any of that. He was simply glad the chase was over. He turned and started walking, catching his breath. East Chestnut, East Marshall, Green Street, Arch Street. He had been around here before. That first day with the girl named Amanda. Other days jogging through, but this was Saturday, not a school day, and there was something different about the streets. Kids, all over. One of them jumped down from a front step and planted himself right in front of Maniac. Maniac had to jerk to stop, to keep from plowing into the kid. Even so, their noses were practically touching. Maniac blinked and stepped back. The kid stepped forward. Each time Maniac stepped back, the kid stepped forward. They traveled practically half a block that way, and finally Maniac turned and started walking. The kid jumped around and plunked himself in front again. He bit off a chunk of the candy bar he was holding. "Where you going?" he said. Candy bar flakes flew from his mouth. "I'm looking for Sycamore Street," said Maniac. "Do you know where it is?" "Yeah, I know where it is." Maniac waited, but the kid said nothing more. "Well, do you think you could tell me where it is?" Stone was softer than the kid's glare. "No." Maniac looked around. Other kids had stopped playing and were staring. Someone called, "Do 'em, Mars." Someone else, "Waste 'em." The kid, as you probably guessed by now, was none other than Mars Bar Thompson. Mars Bar heard the calls and the stone got harder. And then suddenly he stopped glaring. Suddenly he was smiling. He held up the candy bar an inch from Maniac's lips. "Want a bite?" Maniac couldn't figure. You sure? Yeah, go ahead. Take a bite. Maniac shrugged, took the Mars bar, bit off a chunk, and handed it back. Thanks. Dead silence along the street. The kid had done the unthinkable. He had chomped on one of Mars's own bars. Not only that, but white kids just didn't put their mouths where black kids had had theirs, be it soda bottles, spoons, or candy bars, and the kid hadn't even gone for the unused end. He had chomped right over Mars Bar's own bite marks. Mars Bar was confused. Who was this kid? What was this kid? As usual, when Mars Bar got confused, he got mad. He thumped Maniac in the chest. You think you're bad or something? Maniac, who was now twice as confused as Mars Bar, blinked. Huh? You think you come down here and be bad? That what you think? Mars Bar was practically shouting now. No, said Maniac, I don't think I'm bad. I'm not saying I'm an angel either, not even real good. Somewhere in between, I guess. Mars Bar jammed his arms downward, stuck out his chin, sneered. Am I bad? Maniac was befuddled. I don't know. One minute you're yelling at me, the next minute you're giving me a bite of your candy bar. The chin jutted out more. Tell me I'm bad. Maniac didn't answer. Flies stopped buzzing. I said, tell me I'm bad. Maniac blinked, shrugged, sighed. It's none of my business. If you're bad, let your mother or father tell you. Now it was Mars Bar doing the blinking, stepping back, trying to sort things out. After a while, he looked down. What's that? Before Maniac answered a book, Mars Bar had snatched it from his hand. This ain't yours, he said. He flipped through some pages. Looks like mine. It's somebody else's. It's mine. I'm keeping it. With rattlesnake speed, Maniac snatched the book back, except for one page, which stayed ripped in Mars Bar's hand. Give me the page, said Maniac. Mars Bar grinned. Take it, fish belly. Silence. Eyes. The flies were waiting. East End vultures. Suddenly, neither kid could see the other because a broom came down like a straw curtain between their faces, and a voice said, I'll take it. It was a lady from the nearest house out to sweep her steps. She lowered the broom but kept it between them. Better yet, she said to Mars Bar, just give it back to him. Mars Bar glared up at her. There wasn't an 11-year-old in the East End who could stand up to Mars Bar's glare. In the West End, even high schoolers were known to crumble under the glare. To the old ladies on both sides of Hector Street, it was all but fatal. And when Mars Bar stepped off a curb and combined the glare with this super slow dip, stride, slump, shuffle, well, it was said he could back up traffic all the way to Bridgeport while he took 10 minutes to cross the street. But not this time. This time, Mars Bar was up against an East End lady in her prime, and she was matching him eyeball for eyeball. And when it was over, only one glare was left standing, and it wasn't Mars Bar's. Mars Bar handed back the torn page, but not before he crumpled it into a ball. The broom pushed him away, turned him around, and swept him up the street. The lady looked down at Maniac. A little of the glare lingered in her eyes. You better get on, boy, where you belong. I can't be following you around. I got things to do. Maniac just stood there a minute. Something he felt like doing, and maybe he would have. But the lady turned and went back inside her house and shut the door. So he walked away. All right, that's where we're going to stop for today. Next time, this time we do not have any comprehension or vocabulary with these 2 chapters or the 3 chapters that we read the other day. But the next set of chapters will have some vocabulary and comprehension that go with them. All right. Hope you enjoyed that.